its own heritage and that of our whole province through the now well-established annual lecture series. I have a sense of duty also to the large number of Irelanders who share with me kinship with Bishop Kelley. Would you put the first picture in, please? I've entitled this talk, Bishop Francis Clement Kelley, An Introduction to a Romantic Adventurer. That picture was taken from a memorial edition of the Extension magazine, and Cardinal Stritch wrote a tribute, and that was the title of it, And a Romantic Adventurer Has Passed. So that's one tag for you to hang on to, Francis Clement Kelley. I'll try to explain later. Introduction, first of all, just to make it light at first, it's often recommended to try jokes, and I'm going to do it, but whenever I do this, I'm reminded of another story. There was an old Jesuit in Ireland. He was a very learned man, really learned, and he had a great number of admirers, and they used to get him to give talks, but he was dry as chips. He'd put you to sleep, and I've had that experience myself, by the way, with classes. I'd recommend me for insomnia. But anyway, one time they got a young student of his, well, a mature man, but he took him out to lunch, and he said, Father, you know, we admire you so much, but it really, you'd get all the more credit. We'd enjoy it even more if you could lighten up a bit. You know, a little humor. And he, just simple things, no big belly laughs. And they had chicken for the meal. And the former student said, for example, something like this, there was a wishbone there. And he picked it up, and he said, you might say something like this, what great person does this remind you of? And then he pulled it and snapped it, and of course the answer was Bonaparte, of course. And all this tickled him to pieces, and he had never tried this kind of thing, and he determined, at the very first opportunity, he'd try this, and he'd be a great success. He set it up carefully. He was to speak at a dinner, and he arranged that they would serve him chicken and the breastbone. And he got up. He was asked to speak, and got up with unaccustomed anticipation and joy. This is going to be great. He said, I've noticed I'm a bit dry at times, and why don't I lighten up a bit? We should all laugh now and again. For example, and he picked up the wishbone and held it up and said, what great man does this remind you of? And pulled it apart. Why, Napoleon, of course. And the moral is, if you don't have it, don't try it. However, a couple of jokes that come from the soil that Francis Clement Kelley came from, Vernon River. One of them is about the famous Father Doyle that lived out there. And he really was a remarkable man. He was great to visit homes, too. Kind man. And so one time he gave there was a widow who had lost her husband, and it was quite sad. And he gave her a young pig to help, you know. He could feed it and so on. And in all simplicity, she named the pig Doyle, after his rivers. And so the pig grew and became a real pet and a bit of a nuisance. And one of his tricks was that he was fond of pie, and discovered how he could get at these. This woman was good at baking them, and she'd put them to cool on the windowsill. And the pig had disgraced himself a couple of times on that, but she had done that this day, and Father Doyle came around to pay a visit, and he was known to appreciate a good piece of pie himself, and could show up when something like this was baking, and the widow was one of the ones. So anyway, he came up, and there was a pie there, and he didn't knock on the door, just rustled with his cane, and the voice came from the window. "Ah," she says, "Dial, it's yourself. I'm ready for you this time. It's too high, and divil the bite you'll get of the pie today." So it took a little time to live that one down. The second one was about Cardinal Gibbons was a well-loved, you could put it in now, please. He's the first American cardinal, a wonderful man, and he was just, he was admired by all of the United States. And one time he did come to visit the island here when Bishop McIntyre was bishop, and they took him out to Vernon River and to go fishing, trout fishing, and one of the parish members who knew the haunts very well, and really a pretty rough jewel, this fellow, he escorted His Eminence, and there they were fishing, and and fairly soon the bishop, the cardinal, hooked a really good one. They saw him hopping, and he wasn't handling it too well, but the other fellow got all agitated. He said, "Oh, now, be careful, haul him in. He's a real Christer." Now, talking about oral tradition, that was told to me by someone from there generations after. A little more serious in the way of introduction, there's a famous old rule that explains the threefold purpose of an introduction and how to achieve it. First, you want to make the hearer well disposed or interested, even enthusiastic if possible. Second, you want to make him docile or willing to trust and to learn. And third, you want to warn him of the need to be attentive throughout. When you make him interested, by showing him briefly and clearly at the outset how useful and worthwhile the material is. And so he's interested. You hope that certainly should do it. You make him docile by demonstrating that the person speaking has all the material well in hand, its order and any distinctions or clarifications that may be needed. Finally, you make the person attentive by showing that there is a certain amount of difficulty or complexity in the subject. So he'll have to keep listening. Well, applying that to this evening's talk, Francis Clement Kelley is a man well worth knowing. He is a strong kin of us folks and of this island. He is of Irish culture and heritage. He was a great force for good. He is still, almost 50 years after his death, a valuable example for such things as his great faith, his courage, his imagination, his fierce loyalty. And he was a writer with an excellent style, interesting material, and great power to inspire. So I think we can be interested, well disposed. Secondly, for docility. I hope you'll be able to trust me as a guide so that in the short space of 1 hour you may get at least an overview of the career of Francis Clement Kelley. Let me read you part of the inscription originally prepared for the Kelley monument that stands on the lawn before St. Joachim's Church in Vernon River. It's taken from Monsignor Gaffey's beautiful biography, a 2-volume biography, Francis Clement Kelley and the American Catholic Dream. It's available in the university library. The work itself was pronounced a triumph of biography. John Tracy Ellis, the Dean of American Catholic Historians, said that finally Americans have something to set up against what's his name's the great biography of Newman, Ward, I think, Wilford Ward. At any rate, here is a quote that we tried. Kelley's interests were legion: pastoral, military, diplomatic, political, editorial, literary, business, directing and managing affairs. There was one element that held this broad range of activity together. Kelley had a dream. This dream was to make his church truly Catholic, that is, to bring the gospel out of the America of the great cities and into the real America which feeds and sustains the other, the America of the small towns, villages, and countryside. This was the goal that drove him into becoming the greatest home missioner of his age. It was this same goal that led him to the other great achievements of his life: his diplomatic work in Europe after World War I, his faithful service to the persecuted church in Mexico, his exposition of the faith as essayist, historian, storyteller, autobiographer, and speaker, and so on. Such a man, then, has a great deal that can be said about him, but it is a challenge to find a design to point out the unity of that thing, the organic unity. How can such a variety really hang together? I am prepared to guide you through the main lines of that career. Finally, while a guide may lead you safely into the woods and out again, you may not see much more than trees if you don't catch the clues that explain the reason for the many stops and the many interconnecting trails. At this point, I'm going to move into the material. I'm going to run through the broad lines of his life, and we'll be showing some photos during it. And that will give you an idea of the whole course of his life. But as we go, you should be asking questions to yourself, well, how did he get from there to there? I'll return to that after. So Kelley was born in Somerville in Vernon River Parish. His father became a very successful merchant and prominent in city politics. He had a couple of, he was a trader in agricultural products, and he also ran a couple of saloons. And he got into city politics on city council, and he was one of the founding members, the chairperson, I think, of the first city water commission that built the water system. after a disastrous fire in the city, they knew they had to do something about a water system. Frank attended Queen Square School and then St. Dunstan's College. And here's one of the men that impressed him most in his life. This is Monsignor Alexander Macaulay, who for years was parish priest in St. Peter's Bay. At the time that Frank Kelley knew him, he was not yet ordained. He was a student teaching at St. Dunstan's. In between, I think he had begun his theology. But for Francis Clement Kelley, Alexander Macaulay was the prince of teachers. There were none better. And you can get references, by the way, to all this in one of the best books that Kelley ever wrote. He put it out in 1939, The Bishop Jots It Down. And it's available at the University Library. I think they may have only one copy. I'm not sure you can, yes, you can take it out because I have it out. But it's, at any rate, there's only one, but it's well worth it. Thank you. So he had Kelley had an extraordinary imagination, and it was developed to the full. Imaginative essays that they were challenged to write, The Lament of a Penny, The Story of a Candle, and things like this. It's a sheer challenge for imagination. In 1888, he began his seminary studies, 1 year at Chicoutimi Seminary in Quebec, and 1 year of private studies with Bishop Rogers in Chatham. Now, there's a fellow ready for market, should say. But this was a remarkable experience. It was the original way that seminarians used to be trained until it became better organized after the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century. There were institutions, but people used to study with the bishop. And he had a year of that, and he tells wonderful stories about it. It was one of the greatest inspirations in his life. One of the things he would do, he was assistant secretary to the bishop. They'd come for Mass at between 8 and 9, and at 11:45 they might still be standing there while he is putting the vestments on, and he has stopped to talk about this or that council of the church and some father of the church and so on. And so it was just a tremendous inspiration. In 93 he was ordained in Nicollet. He was accepted into Detroit Diocese and given a parish in Lapeer, Michigan. When he was in Lapeer, by the way, he had to wait a couple of months to be ordained until he was 23 years old. So he was young, and he was put as parish priest in this place where there were, I'll be coming back on it again, but there had been a scandal and so on, and there was problems with money and depressing, and he, in the next section I'll be giving you details, but one of the things that he did to try to make money to pay on the debt was he signed up as an army chaplain in the Spanish-American War that began in 1898. And that is the starting point of a lot of things in his life. In 1905, he returned, and there is a section that I'll be explaining where he had in the interval, he had traveled around America a lot, visiting poor churches, lecturing. As a result of it, in 1905, he founded the Catholic Church Extension Society of the United States of America. It's a whole marvelous story. It's probably the biggest single thing about his career. A couple of years later, he joined the Archdiocese of Chicago. In that same year, 1907, Extension received papal approval, and Kelley received an honorary degree from the University of Notre Dame. In 1908, there was the first American Catholic Missionary Congress in Chicago. 5 years later, the second American Catholic Missionary Congress in Boston. Oh yes, just no, leave that. Meanwhile, the Extension Society was really flourishing, and one of the interesting things about Kelley's career is that it can serve as the link for so many different angles of our society. This was the golden age of rail, and as he tried to arrange for people in outlying districts to get the church, to get Mass, this idea struck him of getting railway cars that could be furnished as churches and be moved around the country and serve people who never got to Mass, the chapel cars. Among the other kinsmen, by the way, of the bishop, I see Mike Hennessy sitting here, and Mike's grandmother was a sister of the bishop's mother, Murphy. And one of Mike's brothers, one of Mike's uncles, George Hennessy, was the great helper of the bishop in this operation of, I think, as many as 6 chapel cars that were running finally. And he was knighted by the Pope. He died as Sir George Hennessy. We move on to the next stage, leaving behind, Extension is now well underway, and the Mexican connection, the Mexican and Spanish connection begins. In 1914, all the bishops of Mexico have been exiled, and Kelley has become a contact. They appoint him as their representative for any kind of negotiating they need to do in the States. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson, the Wilson administration, writes to Kelley stating its Mexican policy, which tells you how far advanced Kelley has gotten now, when the administration writes advising him. This is their way of negotiating with the Mexican hierarchy. Pope Benedict XV, in that same year, is trying desperately to salvage something in Mexico. He assigns his Washington delegate to Mexico as well. That year also, Kelley was named a Monsignor, a domestic prelate, and then later the big one, Prothonotary Apostolic. And President Carranza of Mexico in that year was recognized by the Pan American Conference in Washington. That was a bad sign, because it meant approbation, normalization of the communist regime that had taken over in Mexico. Also that year, the Mexican hierarchy approves Kelley's plan to use political and financial pressure in their behalf. And now also, do we have one of Bishop Mundelein? No, must be, yeah, I guess the second one, please. Let's see. Yes, put it in the underneath one. Put it. Bishop Mundelein, and I want it again so you can take it out. was named Archbishop of Chicago. Later he became Cardinal. An interesting little thing, Extension is a very big organization by now, and they put on a big banquet for Mundelein, and there was a very striking thing happened. An anarchist saw a golden chance to get at some of the most celebrated people in Chicago and in the United States. He attempted to poison the whole gathering of 300 with arsenic in the soup. The chief chef caught most of it on time, emptied out the things, and they had, but one of them did not get emptied out, and many people got sick, and it became a famous incident, the poison banquet. It embarrassed him, to put it mildly. Now, moving on to that brings us into the middle of the war. And now, at the end of World War II, a very unexpected thing, and I'll enjoy trying to sort it out for you afterwards. I'm simply giving you headlines now. In 1919, the war had ended, and there was a peace conference in Paris, and a special commission had killed one of the articles, the one on religious freedom, and it did not allow it to be put in. It was supposed to guarantee religious freedom to people. And this special commission had it wiped out. Kelley panicked. He arrived in Paris to lobby for religious liberty. And he began to meet very many famous people, many of whom he had already known. Cardinal Mercier, there's Mercier, the Cardinal Archbishop of Malines in Belgium, a very holy man, very great philosopher, and there's Kelley beside him as a Monsignor. And so he meets Mercier, and then a little later he meets Premier Orlando of Italy, quite by chance, and Orlando raises the Roman question. We're going to talk about that at some length. He raises that with Kelley. This tells you, by the way, the stature the man had. Kelley was already recognized as one of the main opinion formers in the United States through his editorial writings. And then Kelley went on from there with, he becomes a porte-parole, contact among important people. He goes to Rome to meet with Cardinal Gaspari, who was the Cardinal Secretary of State and the great canonist, and Archbishop Soretti, who was head of foreign affairs. He goes to meet them on this Roman question. And Kelley arranges in Paris a meeting a little later between Archbishop Soretti and Giuseppe Brambilla, the Italian counsel to the peace conference. Out of that, there are talks between the state of Italy and the church, something that had not happened for a long time, Soretti and Orlando. That began the thawing of the Roman question. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, and the article that they were trying to save, in fact, was saved, and it granted freedom of conscience in former German colonies. After that, Kelley fell into several other diplomatic roles in London, contacting with the Indian government to stop expatriating German missionaries. He dealt with Cardinal Bourne in Westminster and the British government on the Irish problem. And in 1921, Kelley ended his duties as negotiator on behalf of German missions. I'm going to skip over the last part. In 1924, Kelley was appointed Bishop of Oklahoma, and we might get that. No, the other one, the one that we had earlier, where he's with Mundelein. Yeah. He was ordained consecrated bishop. On the far side, by the way, is another islander, Alfred Sinnott, Archbishop of Winnipeg. And on this side, Archbishop Ruiz, head of the Mexican hierarchy, and the tall man is Cardinal Mundelein. I think I'm going to leave it at that. The Oklahoma years. Kelley became a bishop in 24, and he stopped being active short of 20 years in 1943, and he died in 1948. Now, having gone through the quick overview, I'm going to do what this is where the business of being attentive comes in. To try to in section 2 of this talk, we have just walked through a long series of facts in the history of Francis Clement Kelley. But facts are mere information. They have some value in themselves, but to yield the great power they are carrying, like tons of uranium ore, they need to be arranged in designs to have their relationships to one another identified. They need to be forced to reveal how they lend power to one another. We shall now attempt to do this with Francis Kelley's life on the very small scale that time permits this evening. First off, two general observations. It's useful to recall two long-known aspects of history: its unity and its continuity. The continuity of history means that you can't cut out one segment, let's say a year, from even one person's life, much less from one country's history. You can't cut out one segment and ignore what came before or what followed after, and still insist that you've completely understood or explained that one segment. There is continuity. Any given bit owes something to what went before, and it does something to what comes after. It can't be isolated. Unity means that you can't take one single person apart and say absolutely nothing about anyone else around him, and still insist that you've completely understood or explained that person. There is unity in society, unity in families. We don't exist in isolation. And so, that's an important note. For this reason, every one of us is affected in manners and degrees that we often can't imagine by events and persons and large movements occurring all around us. But some people seem chosen by destiny to sit right at the intersection of many strands of life and history. They often manipulate the strands, or are themselves manipulated by them in spectacular manners obvious to the whole world. Francis Clement Kelley is worth a great deal of study because he was one of those people at the intersections, and he had gifts that enabled him to recognize the opportunities and to seize and run with them. This is the main part of my talk. I've entitled this section, Three Coincidences and Their Long Consequences. The first coincidence: lectures, home missions, and a national and international stage. They seem really not closely related. How would they actually be connected? When Kelley, aged 23, became pastor of a parish in Michigan with debt and scandal attached, he coped with the scandal for a while by public debates. But for the debt and for his own sanity, he was eventually driven to use the remarkable gifts of language that God had given him. In an age before the modern mass media, people eagerly patronized public lectures, which often offered a high level of instruction and entertainment. Kelley signed on with the Chautauqua Agency and was an immediate success. He traveled over many remote sections of the United States in a free month every year, and he got his eyes open to the tragic destitution of the Catholic Church in those remote sections. Some 10 or 12 years after ordination, during part of which he had a life-bending experience as chaplain in the Spanish-American War, Kelley met some highly influential bishops and laity who listened to his distress about Catholic needs in remote places and who encouraged him to proceed with a vision of how to address that grim problem. Kelley proposed to adopt a plan which he had seen working most effectively in several Protestant denominations who were faced with the same problem. In simplest terms, it involved appealing to the wealthy areas in the church to come to the help of the poorest. Nothing could reflect more soundly the deepest levels of gospel faith and the oldest Christian practice. So, with strong but very limited encouragement, that is, not many people behind him, Kelley hurled himself into the challenge. It would be a story far too long for our time this evening to relate the maneuvering and politicking needed toward all the bishops of the United States before finally a great new organization stood forth ready to pull the whole American church together so that the prosperous could help the poor and neglected. That is, the Catholic Church Extension Society of the United States of America, its founder, 35-year-old Father Francis Clement Kelley. We shall confine ourselves to looking at two side effects of the extension story. One, how Kelley became a magazine editor, and for a while probably the most prominent voice of the Catholic Church in America and far beyond. And secondly, how Kelley spent many months in Rome, lobbying, pleading, negotiating to get the huge and slow machinery of the church to recognize and provide for great new changes in her far-flung vineyard. The Extension Society was, in one sense, all about money, how to help the destitute churches, pastors, etc. But that money would come from donations. In another sense, Extension was primarily about the minds and hearts of Catholics. What is your full responsibility to church and world? And that job of Extension would require a vast operation of communication and promotion, and for that operation, Extension would have to generate its own funds. Kelley, the impassioned student of letters and the veteran lecturer, now found the greatest scope for his talent. He founded Extension magazine and for nearly 20 years served as its editor. The monthly magazine flourished, attaining a national circulation of almost 300,000 by 1917 in a truly professional format that could have 50 to 55 pages per issue, with illustrations too, such as they were at that time. Still more remarkable for our story, Kelley, through his sensitive but often hard-hitting editorials and through his skill and reputation as an interviewer, became probably the match of anyone in America for the range of his contacts with any public figure of any importance. He became recognized all through America and much of Europe as one of the key opinion molders of the public. This distinction brought with it, of course, often conflicting responses, even within his own church. Kelley, for his part, could not waste time worrying about this. The distinction brought great opportunities and great responsibilities, and he pushed vigorously onward to address these. As we shall see, the reputation opened many doors for him in other activities where his duty now summoned him. Before leaving the period of foundation and development of extension, we must mark a second byproduct. We've just talked about his marvelous development, progress as a commentator of American life, as an opinion former. Now a second byproduct of that, namely his thorough initiation into the workings of the Catholic Church at the highest levels. One might ask, how could the running of a home mission program in the United States bring its founder director away off into the top echelons of the church in Rome? Coincidence again. How could that happen? The answer to this question has to be found in a fairly long digression. It is tied, rather, to the one word mission, and it has to be found, the answer has to be found in a fairly long digression on the Roman structure of the Catholic Church. No system of government in the Western world is as old and continuous as that of the Catholic Church. Its system was borrowed directly from that of Imperial Rome. We all know that Imperial Rome built the largest and most powerful empire of antiquity. Part of the vast range of its territory and the long duration of its rule was due to a remarkable colonial system. Newly conquered territories were first governed by military law. Next, they were given a pretty large measure of self-government while still remaining strictly under Roman laws and administration. Finally, having proved themselves capable and steady, they could be elevated to the dignity of a province, with a government almost the mirror image of the one back in Rome. When the Catholic Church obtained its freedom in the 4th century A.D., it gradually set up its own system of government based on that of Rome. One department was concerned with spreading the faith to distant lands, that is, to propagate the faith. That department was called the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, for the propagation of the faith. That department is still here. It still controls all missionary activity in the church, and it gives up that control only when the new territory can produce its own priests and bishops. For example, surprising as it may seem, all the dioceses in our Atlantic provinces of Canada were under the propaganda until 1910. Although you probably know, we are the second oldest English-speaking diocese in Canada, set up in 1829. But at any rate, we were, one of the services offered, by the way, was a seminary for those dioceses that couldn't afford one of their own. There was a huge international seminary in Rome. It was called the Propaganda College, and our diocese, and I think most other ones in the Maritimes, had a quota, because we were still under that. We could send one or two people over there, and as a result of that, we had a very remarkable thing in the diocese here. We would have half a dozen men who had had this rich international experience, living at the center of the church and with people from all over the world. Father Terry Campbell and the old Father McIntyre that was in Charlottetown, and Father Nazaire Poirier and people like that. After dioceses are set off on their own, they are still kept under the central control of Rome, but under a different department. But apart from that central control, bishops have an amazing amount of power on their own. Most of this system was borrowed from the Roman Empire. Returning now to Francis Clement Kelley and his dream of a highly integrated church within America, you can start to see the immense amount of red tape that was going to have to be cut. The propaganda was jealous of its empire. Only 100 years before extension, only then had the church allowed a volunteer lay organization to join in the work of the missions, the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, founded by a laywoman in France in the early 1800s. During Kelley's whole career, he made between 25 and 30 trips to Rome. Many of these occurred before 1920, as Kelley lobbied and pleaded for permission and for a flexible form of self-government under the American bishops. Part of the delay, indeed, came from the bishops themselves, who were not in a great hurry to get outsiders butting into their respective dioceses. When the battle was won, Kelley had the precious side benefit of a deep understanding of church government, as well as a good number of powerful contacts at the highest level in the church. As we shall see, this factor played a big role in the later stage of his career. Second coincidence: Army chaplaincy, Spanish encounter, and years of defending the Mexican church. When Francis Clement Kelley was only 5 years ordained, he began a 2-year stint as chaplain in the Spanish-American War. He never actually left the United States till the very end of the war. He never saw action. But he was sent to Cuba with the head Army chaplain on orders of U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt to investigate claims of atrocities against Spanish citizens and of extreme destitution. The chaplains reported back directly to Roosevelt and were warmly commended for their service. Little did Kelley realize that this incident would link with his routine extension work in the states along the Mexican border and would culminate finally in appointment of Kelley as official representative of the Mexican bishops in exile. It was early in this century that a vicious persecution was released against the church by the new communist government in Mexico. Priests and religious were killed, bishops were killed or exiled, all public worship or religious dress was banned. American foreign policy to distance itself from the persecution, to no avail. Republican powers were too strongly linked to favorable trade and business links with the regime in power. Years later, in 1935, when Kelley had become the Bishop of Oklahoma, he told the whole horrible story in his book, Blood-Drenched Altars. Incidentally, this highly praised book of history that tells of the terrible excesses of the Aztec civilization, one of the things they went in for was human sacrifices, an estimate 80,000 in a year, 20,000 at one particular religious celebration. Kelley told the story in this book, and the book could be recommended for many today who hold an idealistic view of primitive cultures and of the terrible impact on them by Western civilization. There are two sides to that story. Finally, the third coincidence. I need my book with one question, because that enters into the thing here very well. You know that the French Revolution was only the first big salvo of a huge earthquake, you might say, to mix the figures, there was disaffection, disillusionment with class society, with royalty, aristocracy. It was the age of the common man coming. Liberalism was part of it, and even Christianity, religion, was devaluated, and reason was put in place. And you had the age of the Enlightenment, and that still continues to devastate our intellectual landscape. But it also had huge political consequences. When you take away a transcendental sanction for law, when you take away the whole relationship between the transcendent and life here on earth, then we're cut loose, and theoretically we could make a good fist of it, but we don't. And the whole 19th century is a clear, terrifying study in that, and of course proceeding even further in this century. But so in the course of the Christian centuries, from let's say the 4th century to the 16th, the Protestant Reformation began. 1517, Luther hangs his theses on the cathedral door, and then you have the Church's own cleanup 28, 29 years later in the Council of Trent. But during those lush years, the Church became too comfortable, too wealthy, too relaxed, and they neglected the poor very often. There were good reasons for the call for reformation. Everyone knew reform was needed. The question was how. But in any event, one of the signs of a corruption in the Church was the no, just stay over there, please. I guess that's it. All right, fair enough. The fact that in the center of Italy, you can even bend that down like that. Bend it. In the center of Italy, there were a number of counties and principalities and so on that had come into the possession of the papacy. And many of the cardinals and so on were counts or dukes. And when the wave of liberalism, of emancipation of the common man, when it came here, it rolled over the whole of Europe. It just started first in France. But in the 1848 was a big turning point, unleashed a lot of things. But Garibaldi and Cavour and other big names belonged here, and they came up. And Rome actually was, the Pope was not just the Bishop of Rome. When you go to Rome, you see all kinds of public buildings and ornate fountains and whatnot, and inscriptions on them established by His Holiness Pope this or that, all over the place. Churches, fountains, public works, sort of monuments. And the popes were temporal rulers. After the thing got cured and they looked back on it, everyone realized that this was an unfortunate situation. But at any rate, the reaction here was to fight against it. And there had been earlier popes, 2 or 3 of them, who actually were known as grand generals out on their horses and armor and fighting back. But this is under the papacy of Pius IX, and so we even had an islander that went to the propaganda just about the time that the revolutionary forces come up, Cornelius O'Brien from New Glasgow, who later became Archbishop of Halifax. He was there as a student and wanted to go out and fight against them. The kingdom of Piedmont, up here in the north, it was the French actually ruled the whole of Italy on there. It was a hangover from the Napoleonic era, but they allowed Rome and these states to remain independent. But when it was evident that Rome itself was going to be threatened, there was a call for defenders all over the world, and there was a special regiment formed, the Zouaves, something like the international brigade that formed for the defense of Madrid during the Spanish War. People who favored the communist cause flocked to Spain and formed the international brigade. Well, this was long before Spain. In any event, the city fell, and they swept up and they set up the kingdom of the whole of Italy, with King Victor Emmanuel as the king. And but the Pope at the time protested, and in protest he walled off the section of his city, Rome, on the other side of the Tiber, on the right bank, and big high walls, and made himself a prisoner inside the Vatican, and vowed never to come out until this injustice was regulated. He didn't come out until 1929. The Roman question stood that long. And so the kings came and went, and nobody wanted to do anything about it. And so it wasn't until the dictator Mussolini came into power that there actually was a concordat, the Lateran Pacts, formed, which satisfactorily resolved the whole problem, created the state of Vatican City, and arranged very, very rich indemnities for Rome for the damage that it had suffered. Thank you very much. So we're going to talk here about lobbying at the peace conference, the Roman question, and the Irish problem. We'll have to start ringing a system of bells or something. 2 for 10 minutes over, 3, and so on. I'll try that, and then you may have to start leaving. Kelley was a true Celt. It shows in his sympathetic meeting with people of all sorts, his deep feeling for mystery and nature, and in his memory of Irish persecution. His grandparents on both sides came from Ireland. His sympathetic nature showed again in his love for French Canada, the underdog as he saw it. And add to this his work with underprivileged people, and above all, his long, painful experience with Mexico, and his innate hatred of all war. It's not surprising then, in the light of all that, that he opposed to the hilt the U.S. entry into World War I. And when the war ended and a peace conference was preparing a treaty to, quote, restore order and satisfy justice, unquote, Kelley's blood boiled as he heard of plans to suppress religious freedom for German colonies and those of certain other countries. Among many consequences of such suppression of freedom would be the outright death of many foreign missions. he raced across to Paris, having managed some flimsy authorization from some bishops, along with the man's many sterling qualities. You know, there are warts on all of us, and he was hard to manage. He had this vivid imagination and this sense of drive and so on, and one can understand a bit of impatience that some other bishops showed toward him at times. Anyway, he got across there, and he began an intense campaign of opposition to an article that was proposing the suppression. The tale is too long to tell even in outline. Suffice it to say that Kelley and his hard-won allies did prevail, and the offending article was removed. More interesting were several side issues roused by the strangest coincidence. The side issues were the Roman question and the Irish problem. I'm going to be going from memory here on. I didn't get all of that written down. Among the people that he met, one was Cardinal Mercier, who raised the question, the Roman question, and said to him, it is almost certainly going to be raised. All of Europe is being cut up. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be dismantled. Vienna, which is the place where he went shortly afterwards, Vienna, which had been the capital of an immense empire, is now the capital of a small country. 80% of the population in the city of Vienna, and the rest out in the hinterland. And so the Mercier pointed this out, and so Kelley had already made a strong case. It was almost certain, see, Germany had been picked as a scapegoat. So they had an empire, as most big countries in Europe did have: Spanish, Portuguese, French, Belgian, British. And empires were going to topple. They were going out of fashion. And the German one was going to go out the ignominious way. It would just be stripped of all that it had. And the Germans were known to have the best missions in the world. A very Catholic country, really, or at least sections of it. So Kelley had good reason to be concerned. Strictly speaking, he was only concerned with home missions. But in the long years working on this, he had become very aware of the vital role of all missions. If we are not expanding, we're dying. You know, if we're turned in on ourselves, we don't have true Christianity. So he, it is the side issues I'm going to talk about. He did win out on the business of religious freedom for missionaries out in Asia and Africa. India had started to turn them out, and that's another group that Kelley dealt with and begged them to stop expatriating their German missionaries. But the Roman question was interesting because as he's wandering around Paris, quite by accident, Signor Orlando, the president of Italy, comes up, and they meet by chance, and Orlando raises the question. This tells how prominent Kelley was. He brings up the question, the Roman question. Is there not, we would be prepared now, he said, to talk to the church about this. Would you know if anything would now be possible? And Kelley contacted the Vatican representative there, and they hustled down to Rome and talked with Gaspari and Soretti, and then they were sent back. The long and short of it was that the question wasn't resolved. It wouldn't have been on the table for the peace conference, but it got talked about, and it just lay dormant for another 10 years. But meanwhile, Kelley then went on to, after things were getting cleared up, he went on to England to spend a couple of months and met Cardinal Bourne, a wonderful man, but who was strongly sympathetic to empire and things like that, and not very sympathetic to Ireland. And you were starting to get the Irish question. In 21 it will burst out, and already the Black and Tans were in there trying to squelch it. Kelley, by his great eloquence and his keen mind, was able to change the attitude of Bourne, and Bourne was able to reach the government of the time, and it is recognized that his intervention did a good deal to allay the Irish question there. So those are three coincidences and some long consequences that they had. In 1924, the Archbishop went down to Oklahoma. It was a missionary diocese. He was only the second bishop. It had been an Indian protectorate. It wasn't a state until something like 1907, 6 or 7. I showed a picture of Alfalfa Bill Murray, a wild kind of character, brilliant, and he was the first governor of the state and also the one who wrote the Constitution for the state. And Kelley became a very good friend of his. Among other people too, I showed you a picture of Mencken, who was a very prominent literary critic and a very acid-tongued commentator on things, and had no time for religion, but he was a lifelong friend of Kelley after they met. I think it was their literary interest that attracted Mencken, but they were genuine. And while he was down there, then he was a bit of a maverick. He had Kelley had a great imagination. He was never too content with just routine running of things. He was always thinking about couldn't this be speeded up or that. And some things that have later come in, Mass in the evening, communion for laity and or by the laity, and the vernacular in the liturgy. These were things that he was willing to talk about. And he also was shrewd enough to use his position to get various personal indults that he mightn't have to recite the office all the time, or certain. It's interesting. He, except that the rest of his life obviously told of his genuine faith and his holiness, but he was all the way through intensely personal on anything that he was doing. He knew the power of formality, of structures and so on, but he was intensely personal. I would have to say something about his writing, and I don't have time. He wrote 16 books, a book of biography, an autobiography, several books of spiritual counseling for bishops, for seminarians, for young people. He was a highly appreciated retreat preacher. He was in early on the radio ministry. Fulton Sheen was an admirer of his. It was kind of mutual, I think. I thought just one little thing came out of Gaffey's thing, that I think I could read you this sample of his sensitivity, Kelley's power with words. He wrote something on architecture. They asked him to write a preface, and it started with, "What is the highest of the arts?" He answers, "Each art will answer that question by a claim to the superiority for itself. I shall answer it by saying that the art which does most to develop all the arts is the highest, and architecture is that art. Architecture is the pantheon of all the arts. Under the roof of its own masterpieces that lift its message above the earth, it shelters the works it inspires. Sculpture carves its arches and fills its niches, fashions its solid adornment within and without. Painting beautifies its altars and brightens its shrines. Ceramics call the glory of the sun through the painted glass to fill its dim spaces with magic colors. Music rolls melody through its pillared cloisters. No art that appeals to the soul is a stranger in the palace of architecture, from the tapestry that hangs over a balcony to the chaste chalice upon the altar. Architecture alone can make such a sweeping claim to leadership. The 10 centuries, brackets of the Middle Ages, the 10 centuries recognized this and gave us the glory of architecture, not in the heavy but beautiful horizontal and vertical lines of the worldly Greek, but in the curves of the Roman and Gothic that suggest the rainbow, starting its brilliant upward climb from 2 points on earth and meeting in a blaze of beauty high in the heavens. Christian architecture is Christian thought. It animates the dumb stone, bids it preach and teach, organizes and spiritualizes matter to give it a soul of its own, and joins all the arts and all the inert materials with which they work in a psalm without words, which God hears as another Benedictus. It is only the world of Christ that could produce such a triumph. Two final things, quick notes. I'm omitting a great deal, but we shouldn't stop this without mentioning someone whom we've learned to appreciate lately. Father Art O'Shea wrote a short biography of A.E. Burke. And Burke was another maverick, if there ever was one. Brilliant and uncontrollable. And he and Kelley were great friends, and Kelley picked him as the head of Canadian Extension. And the correspondence between the two of them is entertainment. It wasn't intended as entertainment, but it is. So let me drop that name in. I mentioned earlier, and we'll close with this, a comment by Samuel Cardinal Stritch when he wrote a tribute to Kelley. Our romantic adventurer is dead. The last paragraph says this: Bishop Kelley had rare gifts of intellect. He might have been a great figure in literature. There was in him something of the poet, something of the artist. But he had knelt long in meditation at the foot of the cross. The motto which he took for his life was love for love. His gifts he used in the service of his King. It was intolerable for him to think of writing or speaking without pointing his work to his life purpose. There may be some who will say that in him the promoter spoiled the artist and kept him always in the realm of the near great in literature. The criticism is not founded. Bishop Kelley was a romantic adventurer, always engaged in the quest for souls. Delightfully human, charmingly personal, beaming with friendship for all men, although learned, not a scholar, although he was at one point nominated as rector of the Catholic University of America. Someone won out, but he was nominated. Bishop Kelley was one of those rare captains in the army of Christ who knew how to reach into souls and make conquests for the King of Kings.
Well, as agreed, if you have some questions, if you please to answer them.
Or to meet them.
There'll be all kinds of questions. Father, what was the story of his going to Detroit in the first place? Why did he leave Canada?
Partly health, I think. He had a kind of a lung condition, and in living and studying in Quebec, he found that it was affecting his health, and I guess that was the main reason. But of course, he wasn't averse to going anyway. He was very interested in the full
Bigger picture.
Yes, yeah.
Does anyone know the land or the farm that he was born on, where that is exactly in Somerville?
Yeah, if you come out of the road from Greenfield and meet the Georgetown Road, it's only a few yards from the meeting of those two, I think.
First house on the left there.
On the left, I see.
First or second house on the left.
I think so, yeah. Going a little towards Georgetown, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there any reference to his life in Oklahoma? Did he have an unhappy time there?
Good question. Your intuition is good. That's another side. It's a really, the last years are sad. It won't shock you, I suppose. We've all gotten our eyes open, but there is a great deal of ambition at work in ecclesiastical careers, and it worked here. There's a theory that many lands have their moment in history, and Prince Edward Island perhaps had it at the beginning of this century. And people were able to dream of great positions, and so he did dream, and you can see it from he would rush in and seize. There was the good of the church, the good of people, but also there was some self-interest. Well, when he went down to Oklahoma, he was content. It was a logical thing. He was given a missionary diocese, but it didn't give much scope to him there. As time went by, he was still reaching out and getting into other things outside. But the record is there. He tried to get different people to push his cause. He really felt he deserved more than this, was destined for greater things. And at the end of it, he had to be told frankly by some people that, no, be content. This is probably your niche. But the last 4 years were, he was very touchy, by the way. He would read offense into some things. and rationalize it. So it was that showed itself. It's one of the things we know about, isn't it? A long life is not necessarily a special blessing. Long lives remove a lot of the masks that we attended to when we were younger. It can be quite a risk.
Did he have any brothers or sisters, or was he the only one?
Yes, he had one brother, actually a younger brother that died in infancy, and then a brother Joe, who was on the railway here. And Joe Kelley married a gallant from Bloomfield. They had one son, Frank Kelley. The two parents died, Joe Kelley and his wife, a year apart, when their son was only 5 years old. And there were three sisters living here. The oldest was Katie, who married John Hughes. Bernard Hughes was one of the sons, the insurance man in Charlottetown. Lucy Gertrude, who married Paddy Clarkin, and Madeline Clarkin taught in Queen Square, and the very sad thing there, the brother Frank Clarkin went to study for the priesthood in Louvain in Belgium, and couldn't make it. He was idealistic, studied very hard, actually weakened himself studying. He came home and lived the rest of his life in the home there as a deacon. He got that far. Anyway, so there was Catherine Hughes, Lucy Gertrude Clarkin, and Celie Foley, and that marriage broke up. They had no children, but she was the sort of guardian for Frank. They lived down in an apartment on Water Street there, the Water and Powell. But so that was his own brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was his attitude, response towards the Native Americans?
He was, did you say ambivalent? No. No, he got along very well with them. He was honored. One of the pictures I could have shown was when Spellman and he were made honorary chiefs of one of the tribes down there. There were Cherokee and Oskagee Indians. There were 5 or 6 ones. It had been a kind of a treaty territory maintained by the federal government, I think, early in. But the Indians themselves were assimilated pretty quickly because it was oil country. There's a lot of wealth there, and he got along very well, to the best I can think of by the way, if we'd had more time, I could have spoken about education. He did bring up some ideas that he had learned in Canada about centralizing universities, have one big charter university and affiliates out through, and this would make for a more efficient use of funds and higher standards. He had seen that at work in the province of Quebec, the classical colleges, all operating under Montreal or Quebec or Sherbrooke. And, so he made a lot of headway with that. But on the native question, it deserves study. Well, you've all been very kind, and you all will get a golden star for sitting quietly tonight. Thank you.
On behalf of the folks who thanked Father, I would like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. Again, it's only an overview. And the only question I have, has anyone done the complete biography of Kelley?
Oh, yes. Monsignor James Gaffey. It is even regarded as a classic on its own, that book. It's a superb piece of biography.
And it is available locally in the university.
Yes.
Well, once again, thank you on behalf of the group here. Unintentionally, we started and ended this lecture series with Mavericks.
How could you avoid it?
Reverend
Talking about the Irish.
I'm not sure we're talking about the lecturers or the subjects of the lecture, or maybe both. But Reverend A.E. Burke and Bishop Kelley, and coincidentally, at least when I was setting up the schedule, I wasn't aware of any connection between them, and I don't know who was guiding that. My only other question is, what is there about Somerville, Vernon River area that produces all these mavericks, you know? Anyhow, this is the last lecture in this year's series, and with the
Not with the band, but with the
well, I think with the band, and we really appreciate you coming down from not the far west, but the Midwest, and we hope that you can come back and join us again before 6 or 7 years. So once again, thank you. Thank you very much. Please stick around. We have lots of food back there, sandwiches and tidbits and coffee and tea, so stay and socialize for a while. Someone want to get the lights?